Moving on now to our newsmaker on the buck stops here tonight. Celebrated author Amitav Ghosh, in his new book, The Great Derangement, has a philosophical and moral question. Why has the great art and literature of our times failed to tell the story of climate change, perhaps the most apocalyptic challenge to our very existence? Is the failure to counter climate change as much about a failure of both culture and imagination as it is that of other institutions? Joining us now on the program is Amitav himself. Amitav, it's a really interesting question. And yet, what struck me is that as you ask why the great fiction of our time has not dealt with climate change, you choose to pose that question in a work of non-fiction.
Yes.
Right? So that's ironic.
That is ironic, yes.
But you describe your family to be ecological refugees. Explain what that means.
Well, ecological refugees are really people who are displaced by environmental impacts. My family, you know, we are originally from the Bangladesh side of Bengal. And the story that my father always told me is that his ancestors had to leave their village because the river changed course. This is a very common thing in Bengal. It's not unusual. So they started traveling and they finally ended up in Bihar on the banks of another river, the Ganga. So, you know, that process has definitely accelerated greatly. Now we see really hundreds of thousands of people being displaced in Bangladesh, being displaced, you know, by sea level rise across India. And I think this is actually going to be one of the most important impacts that we're going to face.
And yet there is that kind of denialism that continues to plague our response to climate change. But on a personal note, you write about how many years later you read a World Bank report that talks about your home city, Kolkata, being sort of in the danger zone, as it were, and you want your mother to move. What happens eventually? Does she move? Or does she look at you like you're crazy?
Not. She looks at me like I'm crazy, and I felt like I was crazy, you know. Because actually, you know, the thing about Kolkata is that a lot of Kolkata is actually below sea level. Sea level rise really is going to be a major threat for Kolkata. Kolkata is also in a cyclone zone. You know, in the past, it has been hit by very major cyclones. In the 18th century, actually, one cyclone almost obliterated the city, you know. Cyclonic activity is now, you know, it's increasing around the world. We are going to see more destructive cyclones as we have seen in the recent past, like Hurricane Sandy hitting New York.
And yet you're unable to persuade her that this is a legitimate reason to move. And it speaks to how many of us respond to climate change. It's still treated as an abstraction. It's still treated as something that happens to other people. It's still treated as something you can't do anything about, so why move?
That's absolutely true. And actually, it's not happening to other people. You know, it's happening actually to middle class people across India.
Yeah.
You know, if you think of these terrible deluges that Mumbai has been through now, that Chennai has been through now, how can we pretend that it's only going to happen to other people? It's happening to us. Look at this terrible heat wave in Delhi, you know, and across India. I mean, it's on our doorstep. It's in our faces. But there again, you know, this is the issue that really interests me, you know. Can you think of a short story that's been written about the Chennai deluge or the Mumbai deluge?
Or a movie or a fictional film that's been made on it. Nothing beyond news reports, frankly.
Exactly. I believe there is one feature film in which the floods figure briefly. But it's so strange. I mean, you know, every other issue, including riots, including communal tensions and so on, there are so many films now. You know, there's so many films, there are books, there are novels, there are short stories.
What explains that? Because the word you actually use, you actually say that later when it is evaluated, who failed us, who failed all of us on climate change, then art and literature, the great artists and writers of our times will not be exempt. And the word you use is concealment. But concealment actually suggests a kind of deliberate glossing over. Is it deliberate, or is it that there has been a failure of imagination, as it were, to actually recognize the perils of climate change?
That's very well put, Barkha. I think it is actually that. It's a failure of imagination at multiple levels. You know, one of the real issues with climate change, I think, is that it's always presented to us as a technical problem that can be solved technically. So it's become this kind of
dense, inaccessible area that a normal person doesn't understand.
Yeah, and actually that's also because certain kinds of experts want to keep their grip on this. You know, they want to keep it as their province. But actually, climate change, you know, there are these technical and technological aspects to it, but it's first and foremost a cultural problem. The problem arises from what you want to consume. Why do people want to buy buildings which are right on the sea with a view of the sea? Why? I mean, you know, I don't know if you've ever lived by the sea, but actually the sight of the sea is not comforting.
Well, you live in Goa. Do you live near the water?
No, I live a long way from the water. I mean, really, I think anybody who moves close to the water now is literally insane. And yet, this is what is happening, not just in India, it's happening in Florida, it's happening along the coasts of America.
So it ties back to imagination, right? Because the argument you actually make is that culture and the self-image as we see ourselves through culture gives us these fantasies. We want to drive a certain kind of car, we want to have a certain kind of home, we want a certain lifestyle. So it comes back to how we imagine ourselves.
It's exactly that. I mean, you know, these last few days I've been visiting friends in Delhi and so on, and whoever can has a lawn, you know. And you think for water-stressed area, such a profoundly water-stressed area as this part of India, and they're spending their water on these lawns. And what makes, I mean, what is it in a lawn that is so desirable? You know, if we ask ourselves that question, you know, so just think of it in those terms. You know, we can approach this issue in two ways. One is that we think of, you know, technologically processing water, or we could just save by not having the lawn, you know.
But if you ask those friends, you know, and ask them, they probably would not even know how much water the lawn consumes. That would be my guess. They would not even see it as something that is potentially a problem.
It's so unutterably profligate, you know, because I mean, especially North India is literally in a circumstance where it's going to run out of water very, very soon.
And yet you argue, Amitav, in this book that the focus cannot be on the individual. It cannot be driven by individual guilt. I think you recount how once a well-known climate change activist is being interviewed, and the interviewer is going on haranguing this person on what his or her individual contribution, you know, how many flights a year do you take, do you use the air conditioner, do you have a lawn? And you're arguing that this is not an individually solvable issue.
It's absolutely not an individually solvable issue. You can change all the light bulbs you like in your home, and it's going to make no kind of dent on the problem, you know, on the aggregated problem. This is a problem of collective action. It needs collective action. It needs us to act collectively. I mean, just as I said, you know, even in terms of resilience, forget mitigation, even in terms of resilience, individuals will never make the move from threatened areas. You know, it's simply impossible, which is why I tell that story about my mother.
Yeah.
You know, just to make that point, that left to individuals, everyone will just be ruled by inertia.
Yeah.
You know?
So let's take you back to where this all begins for you in some ways. You're a student at Delhi University and Delhi's hit by a tornado. You don't quite know what it is. You literally, like some science fiction movie, see objects flying all around you. You hide yourself, you get out of it in one piece. How does that single event shape your imagination?
It had a profound effect on me, you know. It just happened, you know. I'd gone to visit a friend and I was walking down, you know, from the Morris Nagar Road in Delhi University. I suddenly heard a noise, looked over my shoulder, and there's this grey cloud forming in the sky, and suddenly something comes whirling down. And I had the common sense then to actually try and, you know, to take refuge. I think if it were today, I would probably try to film it with my camera and I'd be dead, you know. Yeah. I mean, our world has become so much a virtual world that now we just watch things on screens, you know. There are so many of these, you know, you see these selfies of people who are in very dangerous situations and just taking pictures of themselves. This is, I think, something which is also at the heart of this climate crisis. As you said, everybody thinks it's happening somewhere else. But it's also that everybody thinks it's happening on a screen, that it's not going to affect them.
You mean it's like the Truman Show magnified, that you're always you're always on the sets of some, you know, visualization.
That's right.
That you're actually more stuck in the image than the reality.
That's exactly where we are, you know, that's exactly where human beings are today. I mean, everything has become a spectacle, you know, and people think of themselves as spectators watching this spectacle, but we are not spectators.
So isn't that contradictory? Because fiction likes spectacle, fiction likes drama, and yet climate change has never been told, as you keep pointing out, in a dramatic way. So why do you as a writer think that writers don't want to write about climate change in a fictionalized narrative? I mean, you speak about Arundhati Roy and you say even she's never written a short story or a long story on this.
Well, I may soon be proved wrong, and I hope I am, because Arundhati is, I gather, just finishing a novel, and maybe the novel has some aspects of this in it. But yes, it's a very striking thing. I mean, within fiction, so, it's not that nothing has been done. I mean, there are some wonderful stories about climate change. There's also a sort of subgenre of apocalyptic fiction, and, fiction which deals with that.
But that's always been told in this kind of science fiction way,
That's
never
right.
like it can actually happen, right?
That's right.
It's
And
like the Martians are coming kind of story.
yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, it's so strange to think that we've relegated climate change to the same domain as Martians, as that sort of thing, whereas it's actually happening on our doorsteps. And I think this is a profound sort of challenge, to the human imagination. That is, if writers fail to address something like this, then how can we expect politicians to address it?
But when we do talk about politicians, you actually speak about how what you call the Anglosphere is very well aware of climate change. It isn't like India, where there is a kind of denialism that persists. But you actually link climate change to future military invasions. You say that this could open the floodgates for actually increasing military action in all kinds of spaces. How do you link climate change to violence and military action?
We see it already happening all around us. The link between climate change and security threats is not an obvious one. I mean, and obviously it's a very complex link. But you just look at what's in the news now, the great destabilization of Turkey. And actually, we can trace that back to Syria. And the whole Syrian uprising, there have been many studies now which come to the conclusion that it was, to some degree, prompted by the terrible drought that started in 2008. And which ended up displacing millions of farmers in Syria. And they became, as it were, the hotbed of this resistance. And, we see now that, the consequences of what has happened in Syria has now spilt over into Europe, where it has, in some sense, Brexit, is a result of this great sort of flood of migration that has happened. And, the problem really is that it's very hard to know, we are trained to think of political solutions. But in this instance, even if we were to think of a political solution, how would we put back the ecology? If Syria becomes largely uninhabitable because of this drought, what are we going to do?
But can you separate climate change from energy wars? Or anyone you speak to will eventually say that the invasion of Iraq was at least in part to do with oil, because there were no weapons of mass destruction, as it turned out. And, Sham Saran, while critiquing your book, did say that, but let's talk about energy security as well. Now, how do you see that juxtaposition?
I think energy security is very much behind this whole carbon economy. Alternative energies have existed for a long time. But what happened over the 20th century is that the major currencies of the world, first the pound and then the dollar, became very closely linked to oil. All oil transactions, almost all energy transactions take place through the dollar. So if you're going to switch one sort of energy source to another, it will be a major threat to the world's financial system. So there are all these resistances built into the system, and all of these things are now propelling us towards disaster.
There is a phrase that we in India use often when we negotiate on international fora, climate justice. And you speak about how the Paris Agreement was, you don't use the word, I'm using it, was gobbledygook compared to the Pope's much simpler juxtaposition of poverty and justice. How do you see this notion of climate justice, where countries like India are saying to countries like the United States of America that, our carbon emission is 1.7 compared to your 19 or 17 or whatever. So why are we as accountable as you?
Well, there are many things to be said about that. One of that is exactly this, that, our carbon emissions are actually very, very small. I mean, our per capita carbon emissions are very, very low compared to Western countries. So presumably there should be some, I mean, I completely believe in this concept of climate justice, and it's been one of the most important concepts, in the whole climate movement. But COP21, that is this Paris Agreement, essentially just trashes the whole idea of climate justice. It just sweeps it under the rug. And even the wording of the way that it addresses the question of climate justice is really shocking. It says that this is a concern for some. All questions of equity, of compensation have just been swept away.
And this has been the Indian position all along, that, this is an unfair sort of penalization of countries that have not contributed to the mess that we're in. But then, Amitav, the question would become, who breaks that impasse? Because one of the arguments you make is that it isn't just about capitalism, it is about power differentials, right?
Exactly.
And so tomorrow, even if your economic model's changed, as long as there are dominant powers, this problem continues.
Actually, the real problem with the whole climate, negotiation situation is exactly this, that, you know, emissions and power are very, very closely correlated.
Yeah.
I mean, essentially, it was, it was the carbon economy that allowed the West to gain this stranglehold upon the world in the late 18th and early 19th century. You know, they won the Opium War using steamers. And ever since the early 19th century, really, the carbon economy has accelerated the West's grip upon the world. So, a significant change in emissions would result in a significant change in the international power structure. And we already see this, you know. The fact that China and India now have a different position within the international hierarchy is exactly this, that, we are emitting more, you know. So, if there were to be a cap on the emissions of the West, it would also significantly change the power equations in the world, you know. And I think this is actually the basis for a lot of Western resistance, you know, to...
That it's a loss of power. It's not just a change in the carbon economy. It's
That's
actually
right.
it's actually giving up power.
You know, that is exactly it, because I mean, people conceptualize it often as just a question of of lifestyles, but it's not just that. It's also a question of a relationship, you know, between countries and within countries, between classes.
So do you believe that in a sense the status quoism of power structures is actually what's resisting, or is the pushback to any real change to climate change?
You could say that in a way the world, the question that is foremost in the minds of the powerful people of the world, and in that I include, say, powerful Indians, you know, is how do we proceed with this while keeping the status quo exactly as it is?
If you had a say in it, would you say that India therefore should not ratify a Paris Agreement that you believe is basically sweeping this inequity of power, and who were initially the perpetrators under the rug?
Look, let me put it like this. I think while I'm very critical of the Paris Agreement, we have to sort of give credit where it's due. The Paris Agreement is a significant achievement in some senses. After this, nobody can seriously question, the findings of climate science. That is now, it's now universally accepted that human beings are causing these changes in the climate. And that is a very significant thing. It's also significant.
Well, you just had the new Britain Prime Minister scrap the climate change department. So that denialism is going to...
Governments around the world are saying one thing and doing completely another.
Trump wants to scrap the...
Even Obama, who talks a lot about climate change, but, you know, he's opened up offshore drilling. He's done so many things which, you know, they say one thing and do something completely different. But look, at the end of the day, what do we want? Do we want to survive or do we want justice? That is the really difficult question that we are faced with, because when, you know, that massive cyclone comes for you, what are you going to say? What are you going to say to it? No, you've come for the wrong person. Go and visit yourself on the West.
That is an ominous thought you leave us with. But before we let you go, I do have to ask you about your 4 days at Rashtrapati Bhavan, unrelated to these dire questions that you raise. You know, you've been such a voice against colonization. I remember you didn't accept the Commonwealth Writers' Award once because of that. But Rashtrapati Bhavan to me proves that institutions can move on beyond their original historical context to become your very own.
That's very well put, because actually the building, can you imagine in 1911, there was such scarcity in this country, there were famines, they decided to build the biggest palace in the world. And not only is it big, it's kind of a terrifying building. It's meant to terrify you, you know. And it really serves that function, you know, when you're there. It's sort of an overpowering building, you know. So I can't say that I'm a great admirer of the building itself, but, you know, we have to also recognize that it was built with our blood, our treasure, our money, and here it is. We have to find something to do with it. And I must say, that is what was really interesting to me about Rashtrapati Bhavan, that in as much as you can democratize such a building, there has been a very thoughtful effort to do that, which is one of the reasons why I was there, you know, because, this president has been inviting in writers, artists, and so on. But, you know, even beyond that, what is so interesting, is, a large part of this Rashtrapati Bhavan grounds is actually dedicated to agriculture. Organic agriculture. They have a wonderful wastewater treatment plant. So in many ways, it's a very environmentally friendly sort of approach. They are really trying to set an example, and I think that's an admirable thing.
Well, I think as your book reminds us, those are small lessons to pay close attention to. Amitav Ghosh, a pleasure to have you on the program.
Thank you for having me, Barka. It's been a great pleasure.